Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. If democracy begins in conversation, then we need to nurture a culture where ordinary people like us routinely talk about those things that help us understand each other, whether it's about climate, race, religion, gender, or politics. When we're trying to make sense of our city and the world we live in, every question comes with a set of assumptions about the nature of ourselves and our place in a larger world. The Conversation Lab provides a safe place to talk about some of those things. This program is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver. It's available on air and online on various platforms, and we appreciate the help of Vancouver's community groups. Welcome to the Conversation Lab. My name is Don Schaefer. This is a weekly radio program and podcast where we talk with various community groups, not-for-profit organizations, and changemakers who are working in our various neighborhoods. Jennifer Johnstone is one of those changemakers. She's the president and CEO of the Central City Foundation. She has an extensive background in nonprofit management and community resource development, including experience as a fundraiser, marketing and communications manager, and a nonprofit executive with more than 25 years' experience. The Central City Foundation is a charitable foundation that continues the work of the Central City Mission Society, which was founded, believe it or not, in 1907. It's one of Vancouver's oldest charitable organizations. What is the difference between a foundation and a not-for-profit charity?
So there's actually three different entities in that question. All of us are not-for-profit. We don't distribute profits to shareholders or owners. Nobody owns it. Some of us can accumulate surpluses and reinvest those in the work that we do, but we're all not-for-profit. Within that group, there are registered charities, which are really narrowly defined by federal legislation and regulated by the Canada Revenue Agency. And then within the charities are foundations, are a particular kind of charity, and there are both public and private foundations. And what foundations can do is, primarily what foundations are intended to do is to raise funds and distribute them to charities. And so in Canada, we have some very large public foundations. We have examples like hospital foundations, where you see a public foundation that's closely associated with a particular institution. And then we have community foundations, like the Vancouver Foundation, which of course is a large one, but also, there are smaller community foundations all across British Columbia. I think there's 30 maybe, something like that. And then there are also foundations like ours, which is a public foundation, but unlike community foundations, we tend to have a more singular purpose, and we do not hold donor-advised funds or endowments for others, which is what community foundations do. So many organizations will have an endowment, small or large, that is pooled through a community foundation in order to generate better returns to support their programs and services. So that's a long answer, but it's a bit of a complicated environment. Oh, and there are private foundations. So family foundations and everything from the McConnell Foundation to here in town, the Hussein Foundation, for example, are private foundations created which have some different rules about how they can raise funds. As opposed to how they can distribute funds. All foundations can only distribute funds to what are called qualified donees, and that includes registered charities, but also includes First Nations, municipalities, and some other entities as well.
Did you have to study law when you first started working for not-for-profits? That's quite a lot to know. I was surprised to learn that the foundation has been around since 1907.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I say this, somebody says they are too, but I think Central City is one of the most amazing, best kept secrets of our community. I'm trying to make it a little bit less of a secret these days, but it's an extraordinary story. It's a completely unique story in our country, and maybe nor beyond. It was a group of neighbors, maybe half a dozen men and women, who came together because they saw a need. In those days, Vancouver was a port city. That was really, I guess it was the city of Vancouver, but it was a small city. It was a port city. There was a huge transient population, mostly of men, some of that by legislation, some of that by occupation. So lots of transient men moving through Vancouver, some getting lost at the corner of Abbott and Water Street, and losing their way, and there was nothing. Right? There was barely a hospital. The YWCA did exist, and there were some faith-based organizations, but there were no social service organizations. There was no social safety net. So these folks came together and formed actually a not-for-profit corporation, the Central City Mission Society Corporation. I think they made the name as long as they could, and sold $10 shares in community. Non-redeemable, non-dividend paying shares. And then we made our first investment in social purpose real estate and built a building at 233 Abbott Street that is still there today, and opened that building in 1910 to serve as a social mission. So it was housing, shelter, food programs, vocational programs. It was a place, it was a non-denominational faith-based services were there. So all of the various faith-based organizations would come in at various times to use the space and support people in community. They had a full-time tailor. That's one of my favorites at one time, because you couldn't get a job without a decent suit of clothes. So really pioneered the Goodwill movement, took in donations. So it was a really extraordinary beginning. And then for 80 years, really served the community out of that building, and again, innovated and pioneered things. Some of the very first treatment, alcohol and drug treatment, were taking place out of that building back in as early as the before 1920, and then pioneered youth group homes in the 50s before handing those over to the province later on. And by the late 80s, looked around, the organization kind of looked around and said, there's a lot of other organizations doing this now. So by the late 1980s, of course, there were many more organizations providing social services and supports, whether those were secular or faith-based in the downtown east side. What there wasn't was a long-term care facility for people. And at the same time, in the building on Abbott Street, the folks who were living there were really were aging in place, and it was no longer sort of a transitional housing, and it wasn't a suitable building for that. So the board made the decision to sell that real estate and some other that had been donated to the organization. We took $1 million and seeded and built the Central City Lodge, which is at the corner of Pender and Homer. It is both a complex care facility and home to a drug treatment program for men. It's the only place like it that we know of anywhere, and is an extraordinary organization. It is separate from us because back in the late 80s, early 90s, when we were doing this, the Ministry of Health was scooping assets. They were talking with organizations that had sort of been able to acquire the facilities, and argued that since those were acquired with funds received from the ministry, those assets actually belonged to the ministry. So we didn't want that to happen. So we created a new organization and gifted that asset to that organization. And they have, so it is a separate and run by a separate board and everything. And they do an amazing job, really amazing job. So then we took the rest of the money, which at that time was about $4 million, and created the Central City Foundation. And for a couple of years, kind of did look like other foundations, did some small grants from the income of that, tried to figure out what to do. And then the board, I think, reconnected with the roots and sort of figured out what we had always done differently than others, and began reinvesting our capital in social purpose real estate. So we bought, the first two acquisitions we made were two SRO buildings in the downtown east side. And one we completely restored took back from the pigeons and turned into housing. And the other we restored. And those buildings are now low-income housing, but they also are in the commercial space. Much of it is also community-supported space. So we were the only landlords who would entertain lease with the health authorities when they wanted to create the Naomi research project, which was the medical heroin research project, and which is now the Crosstown Clinic, is in a Central City building. And we've gone on from there to continue to do that and to continue to kind of reinvest the capital, which is one of the things that sets us apart from other foundations, in that about 50% of our capital is invested in our mission in real estate that provides safe, secure, affordable space for community organizations that are helping people improve their lives.
I'm curious how the organization's evolved, and you pretty well talked about that. But just going back to your years in the not-for-profit sector, how has that influenced you, and what has changed for you at Central City?
Yeah, it took me. I've read a lot of our. There's a couple of shelves at the Vancouver Archives given over to Central City. I've read a lot of stuff from the past and spoken to the families, the descendants of people who were part of sort of founding this organization, and there is some connective tissue, and really what the core piece that has always been there is that the folks associated with Central City Foundation shared a belief in the intrinsic value of human beings, truly believe that everyone who is here belongs here, that everyone who is here with us in our community have gifts to share, have both the rights and and it's our responsibility to ensure that people can participate, that people can be a part of the community, and to work hard to support those organizations that are helping people to try to improve their lives, or to participate and connect. So that value is what brought me, that shared value is what brought me to Central City Foundation. I think I brought with me a deep commitment as a feminist and to social justice. And so my approach is a little bit less helping and a little bit more seeking of justice with folks. And I think that shows. But that also fits with that value, right? For me, there's a couple of phrases that really resonate with me. The answer to poverty is not wealth, it's justice. But it also is rooted in that value of believing and valuing people and what they bring to share with us in this world.
What's the hardest thing you have to do?
It's often hard to work with government and policymakers when, we really are, we're driven by community at Central City Foundation. So we're a bit different in the sense that we don't consider ourselves to be the experts on community or what community needs, but we do believe that there are organizations, those that are deeply rooted in community, where people most affected by an issue have some meaningful input into how things are addressed and services and programs are, that those organizations are the ones that will bring to us solutions that we should be investing in and raising money and raising support for. And so that doesn't always put us in agreement with policymakers and government. We're firmly of the belief that, we've created the problems that we have in our community, and whether that's rooted in colonialism, racism, sexism, the inequities in our society. And so, policies reinforce those things or can challenge those things. And we are on the side of trying to help find those policies that can really begin to address those inequities. And that puts us doesn't always put us in agreement with folks in government and folks who are making those policies. And those can be some really hard conversations and some really hard work, in the sense that in championing our community partners and the community-led solutions can be very frustrating and really difficult work sometimes.
This radio program and podcast is called The Conversation Lab. We're speaking with Jennifer Johnstone, who is the president and CEO of the Central City Foundation. I know that you've been leading the Central City Foundation in the downtown east side, especially with the advent of COVID-19. I'm curious what that's been like for you and the people you work with.
Yeah, it's we're a pretty passionate crowd. The word that in truth that comes to me is heartbreaking at this point. People are, I've seen some amazing